Hello, and welcome to this episode, class, whatever you want to call it, on attachment styles and why I believe that examining our own approach to our relationships is one of the keys to knowing we are so much more than this. A lot to unpack in this discussion about attachment. I'm going to be doing quite a few episodes on close relationships, and I wanted to start the discussion about close relationships by talking about attachment, what it is, how we can explore the styles to find healing for ourselves, and how the attachment styles are really like a sort of archetype onto themselves, a spirit that has its own energy that we can work with in ways that help us understand ourselves better, help us to heal relationship, and help us to be more kind and more compassionate towards other people. So let's dive in to the discussion on how attachment styles can help us discover how we are so much more. I'm going to begin with a little time traveling back to when I was an undergrad all those years ago. I was looking for a supervisor for my honors thesis. And I was, of course, a young mother at the time, working my way through school with student loans, very much not, a typical college student. I was a few years older than most of my peers. All of these things that I was bringing with me to the lecture theater every day when I was sitting there in my psychology lectures. And perhaps unsurprisingly, I was having difficulty finding an advisor for me to guide me through, the research and the thesis writing for my undergrad project. And I remember I walked down the hallway. There was a new assistant professor that had just arrived at the university, and they'd even put him like in the worst office. They gave him an office right on the hallway. So, like all of these students were always going by. And I walked into his office and immediately, I don't know, I felt like I got him and he got me. Like there was some sort of common space that the two of us occupied. And so he agreed to be my honors thesis. Little did the two of us know, of course, at the time, that we would spend the next 10 years together exploring human relationships, and that I would work with him all the way through my honors thesis, my master's, and my PhD. At the time, I was captivated by close relationships, and in particular, I was fascinated by this idea of the self in relation to others. For me, thinking back all those years ago, what I was really curious about was how is it that we can be individuals and yet simultaneously we are so many other things. Like we are so much more than just an individual. And Dr. Enrico Di Tommaso, my advisor, opened up this world for me. He was developing a program of study focusing on close relationships and different aspects of psychosocial well being. Particularly, I guess his most famous or his largest contribution to the study of the self in relation to others has been his work on loneliness. I thought loneliness was a very lonely topic. but I immediately kind of dove in and started to become familiar with his research program. And human attachment really pinged for me. There was that moment that there was a attunement between me and attachment theory and research that I felt like a world opened up to me. I had grown up as someone who really struggled with interpersonal relationships. I didn't feel close to my parents. I had problems with friendships. And I also really had a hard time with romantic partners. So here I am, a young mother in my early 20s, put myself through school on student loans, using student loans to keep my son in daycare, my parents being so helpful in terms of looking after him. Like there's just so much going on. If you can imagine this kind of busy life, and in a little tiny room, in the basement of this building, sitting in front of the computer in the 90s, I was captivated by the world of attachment theory and research. And I remain so now. You can consider this whole episode uh, a, an entry in Hecate's Keys, because I think understanding relationships and ourselves is absolutely key to just living a whole life, living from the center of our being. There's no one way of being in the world. There's no one relationship. There's no one orientation that's going to be better than the others, but there is a lot of research and thinking about what good enough relationships look like. And I really want to emphasize that because it's a concept we work with a lot in my school, is that we are good, we are enough, and we are becoming. That this is not about perfectionism. It's not about having the perfect relationship or being the perfect person or the perfect partner, perfect friend. It's about becoming more than what we were before and healing into our unique wholeness. So let's get into talking about the history of attachment theory and some of the research and some of the ways that we can work with attachment styles to become more. So let's light our candle. I hope you have, if you're watching or listening, I hope you take a moment to grab your candle and light it along with me. And let's work with the energy of the candle in the context of this discussion on attachment styles. So if we consider that we have two orientations in the world towards all things, let's work with those ideas. So if you do the Enodia Oracle, or if you're familiar with what I call the approach avoid daily card reading in the Keeping Her Keys book, you'll know that these two basic orientations are avoidance, what we are moving away from, ignoring and so on, banishing, removing, and approach, what we are manifesting, what we are moving towards, what we are becoming. That approach and avoidance are the two great energy dichotomies that we work with. And we work with them in the opening ritual I do at the beginning of all of my classes, in that we start by a cleansing or a purification. And that is like the energy of a void. It's what we're sending away, right? We are sending away things that block and bind, toxicities and hassles and so on. We're doing this symbolically with a candle to get the energy flowing. And then we're approaching as we're protecting ourselves, and we're bringing towards us. And that these two dimensions, avoidance and approach, are really at the heart of exploring human attachment. In the Keeping Her Keys book, I included an exercise, and I think over the years, what I've heard from readers and students is that this exercise at first seems very daunting, and once it's done, it's transformative. So in the Keeping Her Keys book, I didn't specifically come out and talk about attachment styles, but what I did is develop this exercise known as using the power of Hecate's epithets. In my further teachings and in the school, I call it the Agape Phoberos ritual. And there's also an Agape Phoberos meditation and so on. So this exercise that has its roots in the Keeping Her Keys book has the student take a list of epithets, which are different titles that were applied historically to the goddess Hecate, to take those epithets and then use them to invoke either agape, like pure flow love, not a romantic love, not sexual attraction. It's like that pure love state. And phoberos, which is fear, so the pure fear state. Love in general is what we're approaching, and phoberos fear is what we generally want to avoid, right? So you can map it onto those two dimensions as well. So in this exercise, there's a list of these different titles that may evoke fear for you, and ones that are loving and gentle and kind. So I'm just going to read a little bit from this exercise in the Keeping Her Keys book. So this is a deep dive into love and fear. And again, that maps on to the attachment styles. That secure attachment has that agape energy, and the insecure attachment styles are driven by fear. So I'm asking the student to record feelings of love or energy, feelings of love energy or fear energy in the week before doing the exercise, just to get into the concepts. And I give some examples of emotions that are love-based: kindness, contentment, joy, love, kindness, responsibility, fear emotions, anger, despair, depression, anxiety, loneliness, sadness, and rage. And then I encourage the student to do some written explorations of their own emotions and then to go into this exercise. So in this exercise, I provide these fear-based titles of Hecate, such as Nikia, Nightwalker, Phobos, fearful, Polyomenos, sufferer, Scotia, which means dark or gloomy, and love-based epithets such as Aglaus, pleasing, Calliste, Ferris, Melano, soothing, Peonios, healing, Teletos, patient. These all come from different ancient sources. And then the exercise is, you prepare your sacred space, you do an invocation of Hecate, and then you chant the epithets that you chose to represent fear, and you allow yourself just to feel that fear energy in the sacred space, and then you do the loved-based ones afterwards. Of course, we start with fear and then do the transmutation of fear into love. Working with our emotions this way brings into clarity how we orient ourselves towards these feelings. Fear-based emotions, they land on that avoid spectrum, right? Like we tend to want to seek an equilibrium where we're not angry, we're not anxious, we're not depressed, we're not frustrated, we're not in any of that fear quadrant. And intentionally exploring fear helps to make us aware of it and helps us to build a relation to fear itself, because the more we have excessive avoidance and even denial that we feel these things, the more difficult it is for us to get out of its grips. Because in my thinking, emotions are spirits unto themselves, that they are larger than us, and that they are part of, what's sometimes called the collective consciousness of the world. These emotions have energy. And when we loop this back to attachment styles have energy too. In my next book, Entering Hecate's Cave, I really dive a lot more into relationships. And in the True Magic book, my first book, there's a whole chapter on relationships. So if you want to go deeper into my thoughts on a spiritual, bit magical understanding of relationships that merges the psychological research and thinking with practices, there is that whole chapter in True Magic. Like I said, in the Keeping Your Keys book, there's that exercise. And then in the fall of 2022, hopefully, my new book will come out. And there is a lot on relationships, from the parent-child relationship, soul retrieval for healing those wounds that we may have, those attachment wounds from early in life, to understanding your attachment style in general. And I do think that knowing our attachment style is a great place to begin to heal all of our relationships, because the one common factor in all of our relationships is us. We're in them. So attachment styles are a way, they're part of the map, right? They're part of the map. They're this key that brings things on the map of our lives into sharper focus. There's 4 basic attachment styles in the way I teach them. You'll find some authors talk about 3 styles. I use the 4-style model, and it just makes more sense to me to divide the fearful styles more into better categories, because I think for us, in terms of personal healing into our own wholeness, the more kind of information and the more precision something has, the more we can perhaps see ourselves in it, and then the more we can use it as a healing tool. The 4 basic attachment styles work from infancy right through the lifespan. So they are true, like they're a style, an archetype onto themselves. They are something that, whether it is the child relating to the primary caregiver, the partners in an adult committed relationship, close friends, even the individual in relation to a group. That was my doctoral dissertation, was on attachment to groups. We have this style, and I want you to think of this style as an energy current. And that's an energy current that we emanate interiorly to ourselves, in how we understand ourselves. And it also kind of emanates out from us towards all of our other relationships. So in that sense, our attachment style is part of our energetic field. The attachment style is often not in consciousness, but is at this subconscious level. And I'm going to clarify what I mean by subconscious, because different authors write about it different ways. So for me, there is the consciousness. Think of the consciousness as things that are in your mind right now, easily accessible, things you can quickly call to mind. Consciousness, right there, kind of on the blackboard of your mind, all those things. Just take a moment here and check in and see what's on that blackboard right now. Consciousness. When we do spiritual work, generally the focus is on unlocking what is not conscious. The subconscious, the way I teach about it, is what is slightly outside of consciousness, It's not something that we specifically would think about or call into regular consciousness, but it is available to consciousness should we call it up. And that the subconscious is like a netting around the consciousness. So, in my thinking, the subconscious is where kind of our general operating guidelines live, things we don't have to explicitly think about. So, one example of something that is in the subconscious most of the time is like walking. Like, we don't have to think about walking for most of us, we just do it. The program for walking can be called into mind. We can consciously think about walking and the steps of walking, but we don't have to do that in the same way as we might have to consciously activate like a plan for how we're going to do what we're going to spend our day on. The day will take care of itself one way or the other. It's about how we engage with it. If we bring it into consciousness and make a plan, or if we just go with the flow. Another example is if you drive a car. When you first learn to drive, it's very much in consciousness, and then it becomes like encoded, so you don't have to think about it. So all of that programming that we're wired for about driving a car goes into the subconscious. If we need to call it up to consciousness, we can. It's not specifically numinous. It's not like going into the dream world or doing a transcendent meditation or ritual. To me, that is deeper work of the unconscious and taps in to the world of archetypes, the world of magic, the world of the symbolic, and so on. So the subconscious and the unconscious, at least in my thinking, there is a distinguishment between the two. Attachment models, which are the schema or the rules that we've learned about how to orient ourselves towards others and who we are in relation to others, those largely exist in the subconscious. These are formed when we are really young. And all the research points very conclusively to what happens in the first year of life between an infant and their primary caregiver is incredibly influential for the trajectory of the infant's life. This is not to say that what happens in that first year, if it is troublesome, that it can't be overcome. It certainly can, and it's never too late to work on healing. It's never too late to explore your attachment style. But these early exchanges in the environment, especially between the primary caregiver and the child, typically, of course, the mother, but not always, that these set a life course journey for the child, where the journey will be easier or more difficult based on the things that happen between the mother and the child. And this is not to say that the primary caregiver, if their ability to provide care for the child is not good enough, it's not blaming them. This is a way of understanding. It's not about blame. And I think this is where we can use attachment styles to kind of remove some of the blame game, that some of that trauma trap we can fall into. I've certainly fallen into it in my life, resentment that, we had a troubling childhood and we had caregivers who were not good enough. That, it's a way to overcome that. It's a way to examine what was going on rather than blaming anybody. So, of course, this environmental piece of the developmental trajectory is intertwined with biology, that we are coded at birth with certain traits and abilities, such as being if we are an introvert versus an extrovert, that's a pure personality trait, and where we fall on those dimensions, that those things that we're hardwired for will interact with the environment throughout our lives. And in my way of thinking, our personal astrology is really entwined in this business as well. Astrology offers us an archetypal explanation for a lot of personality characteristics, which adds a really symbolic and beautiful layer to exploring ourselves. And understanding this interplay between who we are as individuals and how our relationships play out, it's really important in any discussion about healing, because as long as we see ourselves as completely separate from others, for good or bad, then there's going to be kind of a truncated experience of healing. We are creatures who are always in relation to others. So from this early childhood caregiver relationship, it's like we develop a set of glasses for seeing the world. And our glasses either are kind of optimistic glasses, where we feel that the world is generally good, and that if we need something, it will generally be responded to with kindness and support. And we develop a sense of having a secure base, and that secure base empowers us with the tools necessary for exploring the world, developing our personality, fulfilling our destiny, and so on. That this idea of a secure base from which we can explore the world is really central to attachment theory. And that if we don't have a secure base, if we didn't learn that our primary caregiver could be relied upon, and that when we were in distress, that they would respond to us in appropriate ways, if we don't have that secure base, then we are always kind of fighting this uphill battle with the world, where we don't come from a knowledge that that others can be trusted and that we are worthy. Because what happens to the infant when they are in distress, they're hungry, they need their diaper changed, they just want attention, they want to be played with. When that infant is conditioned by the caregiver to not have those needs met, there is a deep sense of unworthiness that can develop in the infant. I mean, we'll call this low self-confidence, high anxiety. There's lots of ways that this can take form throughout life, but there's this fundamental, I am not worthy of appropriate care. I am not worthy to be heard. That happens. So we develop, instead of an agape or secure style where we trust ourselves, trust others, have generally decent confidence, and generally think that that we can be efficacious, that what we do in the world matters, and that we'll succeed in general, and that when we fail, it's okay. We can pick ourselves up, carry on. So we don't have that in the fearful styles. And the fearful styles are often divided into anxious and avoidant. So if we think of secure as like the approach style, it's the agape style. It's like you're moving towards the world, you're curious about the world, you have a general trust in the world, you have good discernment as you grow up, and all these things. And you think that you can succeed in general. Anxious attachment is that you've learned early in life that your primary caregiver is not going to respond to your needs, and the response that was coded for you was an overwhelming desire for closeness, but always feeling like it wasn't going to happen, and that the child is always like seeking attention. and very worried about the approval of the caregiver or other parents. And there's this anxious style where there's just a lot of anxiety around relationships, but they're moving towards relationships. They're not avoiding them. So in the avoidant style in children, avoidant attachment is so the kind of the gold standard of attachment testing in young children is what's known as the strange situation, originally developed by Mary Ainsworth. And in this, and I've done strange situation research, and it's one of the most beautiful and touching types of research, going in and observing caregivers, mostly moms, with their infants. And most moms are so responsive and loving, and the children reciprocate, where they like having her around. But then there are the anxious ones who, of course, when the mom leaves, they can be very upset or not even notice. But when she comes back, they can be very, very agitated. The avoidant children, what they do when the mom comes back after the period of separation is that they don't even take notice. And when the caregiver is there, when they're playing with the toys, they're not a focus. Like, typically, if you think of a small child playing with toys, when there's an adult in the room, they'll try to engage them, like show them the toys, and smile at them, make eye contact. Avoidant children tend not to do that, whereas anxious children do it too much. And secure children, there is a balance where they have their independence, yet they also seek the comfort and attention of the caregiver. And when the caregiver comes back, they're happy to see them. And when they leave, they're distressed, but they're not completely broken to pieces. So those are the three styles: secure, anxious, and avoidant. Oftentimes, there is also a straight up disorganized style, which is a pattern found in the children who suffer the most maltreatment, where they just don't know how to act. They're a mixture of anxious avoidant, right? Like they're not one or the other, they're a mixture, and it's really challenging. So that would be the fourth type, where they're high both in avoidance and anxiety. In adult attachment, that fourth type is called fearful, where there's this mixture of all this relationship anxiety and all this relationship avoidance. It's a very, very difficult way to be in the world, as I'm sure you can imagine. In adulthood, secure attachment is characterized by a general sense of confidence in relationship, whatever type of relationship it is, and not obsessive behaviors, being courteous, kind, responsive, but not clingy. Avoidant pattern behavior, which is usually called dismissive if it's purely avoidant. These are the people who you never quite feel like you matter to them. And if you are a dismissive avoidant in adulthood, you tend to downplay the importance of relationships. And it's not because you don't want the relationship, it's because you kind of have this background of programming where you've learned in general that if you do try to engage in a relationship, it won't be successful and you'll get hurt. So the styles carry right through from infancy to adulthood. And most of the relationship research on adults has focused on dyadic romantic partnerships, although friendships and even belonging to groups and communities, that certainly serves an attachment function as well. So it's not just these committed monogamous relationships that have they're intimate and they have sex as part of them. That's not the only type of adult attachment relationship. Although, of course, that gets most of the attention because our preoccupation in our society today is with romantic relationships. And I think we tend to downplay the importance of other relationships to our detriment, and just hyper focusing on these idealized romantic relationships. And secure attachment is not about idealization. It's not even necessarily about, a romantic relationship. It's about an orientation into the world. The research shows that about 50% of people label themselves as having a secure orientation, which means in general, they are comfortable with themselves and they are comfortable trusting others, and that they engage in appropriate levels of sharing, support seeking, and so on. About 50%. That's self-report. So, we tend to sometimes on these self-reports, and I've given self-report questionnaires to thousands of people, there tends to be a little bit of a bias in some people to make themselves look better. Um, so it could be some of that going on. But if we go with that statistic, okay, about half the population has this orientation towards others that is in general secure, and about half the population has one that is in some aspect of fear. So they're either preoccupied with relationships, that's the anxious style, or they're avoidant of relationships, the dismissive style, or they're both high in anxiety and high in avoidance, and that's the fearful style. Not the best word for it in adulthood, because dismissive, of course, and preoccupied they're all fearful styles. So these are the 4 styles for adult attachment, and that map directly onto childhood attachment. I've put up these 4 styles in the school in the month of Rixapile Hub in the Hecate's Keys course, and they'll be in my next book coming out in the fall of 2022 as well. So if you want to explore them more, you'll find that they're featured for this month. So I'm making this recording for the month of Rixapile, which starts February 1st, 2022. Do the 4 styles. I always say don't spend too much time microanalyzing them. Just choose the one that pings and see that as a starting point. See it as a way to explore yourself and know that they can be changed. When we were recording the month of Rixapile preview class, myself and the other staff members at the Covina Institute, one of the things that became really clear is like how attachment styles can change when we do the real work, when we do the meditation, when we do the work on ourselves, that we can move ourselves towards that agape, that love, secure orientation where we learn to trust ourselves, we learn to, in general, to trust others, and we know when not to trust others. Security isn't about blind faith. It is about discernment. But it is also about not feeling that we can make ourselves whole through another person. So in that sense, secure attachment leans up against depth psychology and Jungian psychology in the idea of like that individuation, that being wholly who we are meant to be empowers us to have like better relationships. Being more who we are, when it is done in a way that is healing, doesn't separate us in that weird kind of individualistic culture, that we are the supreme being and, everybody else kind of falls at our feet. When we don't get caught up in that kind of individualism. Individuation and individualism are very different concepts. Individuation is about being wholly who we are. Individualism is the individual comes first. And within attachment theory, where we're focusing on the self in relation to others, how I understand myself is connected to how I understand my relationships, and these kind of subconscious models that I may have developed very early in life. And it's about bringing those subconscious models to mind and exploring them with compassion and not being judgmental about what our style might be, not thinking that we're doing something wrong, but just having that open dialogue. Yes, I could be more trusting. Or I do tend to be really enmeshed in my relationships. How might I change that? Where do I begin? The Keeping Your Keys book, certainly like as an introduction, has a great skill set to get you on your way, whether it's avoidance or enmeshment, whatever your suboptimal ways of orienting yourself towards others might be. It certainly has the keys to get you started on that journey. And then my next book will really take you deeper on that journey. I want to say this in closing, that exploring our attachment styles and our relationships, it really has a profound healing effect. And something that I have noticed over the years of doing this work is that there can be a resistance to looking at our attachment style. There can be a resistance to wanting to examine like our relationships, like ourselves within our relationships. And this resistance can be really difficult to overcome, and it is entirely doable. So if this feels like I can't do this is way too much for me, it's okay to take a time out from this exercise. Work on that agape phobos exercise in the Keeping Your Keys book and be gentle with yourself as you go through it. Don't beat yourself up. It's really challenging to start to explore love and fear energy, whether in the context of that ritual exercise in the book or through a more psychospiritual approach by looking at our attachment orientations. It can be a lot. Go gentle on yourself and just know that you are so much more than any problematic relationships you've had in the past, and you are so much more than if you currently kind of have a difficult attachment orientation towards others. You can do this. You've got this. Go easy, go gentle.